the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. Live from the Greene Space today. And as some of you know, when we're in the Greene Space, you can watch the Brian Lehrer Show as well as listen to it because we stream live video from here. You can go to WNYC.org. It should be on the homepage, or you can go to WNYC.org/thegreenspace if you want to watch the Brian Lehrer Show today. And of course, we have to start with the contrasting audio clips of Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen yesterday afternoon and the audio obtained by ProPublica inside one of the child separation centers near the Mexican border. If you haven't heard the ProPublica sound yet, brace yourselves because this is really hard to take. And if you understand Spanish, the words of the border control agent in this clip make it even harder. We'll translate afterwards. We've only pulled 35 seconds of a 7-minute audio tape of 10 children separated from their parents or guardians and clearly distraught.
Bueno, aquí tenemos una orquesta.
No me quiero parar de mi padre.
The words on the tape from the Border Patrol agent, as translated by ProPublica, were, "Well, we have an orchestra here, right?" So that indicates there were multiple children crying. And then he makes a joke. "What we're missing is a conductor." Very funny. And then an unidentified man's voice saying, "Don't cry." So at a press briefing yesterday, Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen had not yet heard that tape, nor had she seen the NBC News videos of children in a cage, but she said the press is focusing on the wrong things.
Since 2013, the United States has admitted more than 500,000 illegal immigrant minors and family units from Central America, most of whom today are at large in the United States. At the same time, large criminal organizations such as MS-13 have violated our borders and gained a deadly foothold within the United States.
So that was consistent with what President Trump was saying earlier yesterday, what historian John Meacham on Morning Joe this morning called weaponizing immigration, portraying Mexican migrants not as family seeking a better life, but as enemy combatants.
You see about child separation, you see what's going on there. But just remember, a country without borders is not a country at all. We need borders, we need security, we need safety, we have to take care of our people. You take a look at the death and destruction that's been caused by people coming into this country without going through a process.
So let's start there with our first guest today, Catherine Rampell, business and economics correspondent for The Washington Post. Hi, Catherine. Welcome back to WNYC and welcome to the Greene Space.
Good to be here.
And listeners, I see some of you are calling in already, so on any side of that issue or anything else you might want to talk about with Catherine Rampell, and we're definitely going to go to tariffs, which is a big story today. There are big shocks on stock markets around the world this morning in response to the U.S. and China going back and forth in the way they've done the last few days, so we'll get to that and some other things. And it's all fair game on the phones, 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692, since there seems to be some pent-up demand to talk about the audio that we've played so far and that whole story. More calls coming in than usual before we even give out the number. Just want everybody else to have it. 212-433-WNYC, 433-9692. And Catherine, my God, that crying children tape, has the administration responded to it directly as far as you know?
Not that I've seen. It's possible I've missed something, but I thought it was very telling that Secretary Nielsen yesterday said she had not heard the audio, even though it had been everywhere for a while at that point. I think the press conference was at 5. And beyond that, she also claimed that she had not seen photos released by CBP, Customs and Border Patrol, I believe is the full name, which is under her purview. CBP is in the Department of Homeland Security, of which she is the secretary. She claimed she had not seen the photos of children in cages, which were very upsetting, I think, for a lot of people. One of the journalists who was at that press conference asked her, well, why haven't we seen photos of the girls? Why haven't we seen photos of the toddlers and babies who have been taken from their parents? And she didn't really have an answer. So I don't know. The whole thing is stomach churning, and this administration can't seem to keep its story straight.
And I guess what the audio tape reveals is that if people are saying, don't worry, these children are being well taken care of, this is not traumatic, we're protecting them, then this reveals something different that's just emotionally, and it's audio tape, so it's not on display for people to hear, but it's certainly, to see, but it's certainly on display for people to hear. And then the Border Patrol agent says, sounds like an orchestra here.
Yeah. And there have been lots of other stories that may not have the same sort of salience because we don't have audio or video, but there have been other stories that have come from advocates who have visited with children or who have visited these detention centers saying that the people who work at these various kinds of facilities are not allowed to pick up or comfort very young children who are crying out for their parents, children who are in diapers. They can't be comforted. They can't be picked up. They've been ripped from their parents. I mean, the whole thing is incredibly upsetting. And I think part of the reason why the administration keeps sort of obfuscating about what's going on is that it's very difficult to defend it on the merits. So that's why you have conflicting explanations. You have John Kelly having said it was a deterrent, Sessions saying it's biblical, you have Nielsen saying it's not actually a real policy, Trump saying it's a democratic law, which makes no sense. There are all of these conflicting explanations because, again, it's very hard to defend what we're doing on the merits.
So let me actually play a longer excerpt of Homeland Security Secretary Nielsen at her briefing yesterday, explaining and defending, as she describes it, when they separate parents and children, and get your reaction, including fact-checking, if any.
We have a long existing policy, multiple administrations have followed, that outline when we may take action to protect children. We will separate those who claim to be a parent and child if we cannot determine a familiar or custodial relationship exists. For example, if there's no documentation to confirm the claimed relationship between an adult and a child. We do so if the parent is a national security, public, or safety risk, including when there are criminal charges at issue, and it may not be appropriate to maintain the family in detention together. We also separate a parent and child if the adult is suspected of human trafficking. There have been cases where minors have been used and trafficked by unrelated adults in an effort to avoid detention. And I'd stop here to say in the last 5 months, we have a 314% increase in adults and children arriving at the border fraudulently claiming to be a family unit. This is obviously of concern. And separation can occur when the parent is charged with human smuggling. Under those circumstances, we would detain the parent in an appropriate secure detention facility separate from the child. What has changed is that we no longer exempt entire classes of people who break the law.
So that's very rational sounding, but what a disconnect from the audio of the kids, which again, in fairness, she hadn't heard when she spoke, but you almost suggested a minute ago that she willfully hadn't heard it because it was everywhere.
Look, I don't know what her motivation was. Maybe she was in meetings all day, but it's her responsibility to know what's going on at these facilities. And I would also point out in that explanation that she gave, she said that if you come at a port of entry and you present yourself for asylum, you won't be separated. That is demonstrably false. If you look at the ACLU legal filings, they have filed for a class action suit representing the families that have been separated at the border seeking asylum. They have multiple clients, named clients, who have been separated at ports of entry, so that meaning, just to explain the technicalities, that they did not unlawfully cross into our country. They got up to the border, they said, "Hi, I'd like to apply for asylum, I'm here with my kid." They did not actually commit the misdemeanor of crossing the border unlawfully, and they were still separated from their biological children. And were separated for months. So it's just not true that they're only separating families once they've crossed the border, if they broke a law, et cetera, if you present yourself at a port of entry. Beyond that, there have been lots of stories about how the ports of entry have been blocked off recently, or there are multiple days-long waits once you get there, once you get to the bridge or some other port of entry, and you say, "Hey, I'd like to apply for asylum." People are waiting days in the hot sun without food or water, again with toddlers, sometimes with babies or other children of various ages. And so it's easy enough to tell them you'll be exempted from this horrible policy if you go to these places, except A, they're not following their own policy, and B, they're making it very difficult, even if they did follow their own policy, to apply in exactly the manner that the administration has suggested.
I want to take a phone call from a listener. We're going to go to Ahmad in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, calling in on line 9. Ahmad, you're on WNYC. Hello from New York.
Good morning, Brian. Good morning to your guests. First of all, I'm an immigrant. I lived here in the country quite long enough, about 12 or 13 years. And I've been following the news for last 2 days or so about ripping the children from their parents. And that's not the American we knew. That's not the leader of the free world. The leader of the free world opened their arms for people, welcomed them, and just this thing is really disappointing. It's humiliating. It's kind of disturbing to me as the father of 2 children. Imagine if I'm not living here legally, that's what happened to me. So, like I was telling your screeners, this reminded me of the ship that's been turned back coming.
I think he used one of the 7 words you're not allowed to say on radio or television. So listeners out there, though people could hear it in the Greene Space, that's why we electronically jumped out of that call. But we understand what Ahmad was saying to the thrust of his point. So let's go to another caller on line 6, Quincy in White Plains. Quincy, you're on WNYC. Thank you for calling in.
Hi, thank you. I just was calling to say, I was like, I'm really hurt by that audio. I can't lie, because I'm a father of a 3-year-old little girl, and I don't know what I would do if we were in this situation that these families are in, being separated, and just really doing what they're doing out of desperation. And I also wanted to say that because I was actually I didn't vote. I'm not gonna lie, I didn't vote for Trump in the last election, but I was starting to warm up to him prior to this a little bit, because the economy is doing well. And I know, I'm kind of neutral in terms of, Democrat, Republican, but I know the liberal media and the more conservative media, they take shots at each other and stuff. But this is really, there's a lot of friends of mine who were starting to warm up to him too. They weren't necessarily supporters, but again, because of the economy and other things. But this totally kills it, and this totally turns people, just against them. It's just so ugly. It really is. But on the flip side of that coin also is that, the people who are coming here out of desperation, they also need to understand they're dealing with a really, really hardcore administration. And they got to understand before they leave their countries that, look, there's consequences to bringing your kids across those deserts or across those rivers, across those mountains and stuff. With coyotes and all types of, kind of seemingly unsavory characters and stuff like that. So I think on both sides, there needs to be more truth spoken,
Quincy,
especially in the liberal media. You know what I mean? Because, this is dangerous stuff that, I know they're coming out of desperation, but again, I can't really say what I would do. I don't know what I would do, but Jesus, you're putting your kids through a lot, and people just have to understand this administration is hardcore.
Quincy, thank you so much for your call. Please call us again. Wow. Catherine, Jeff Sessions has said as much, that this is a policy of deterrence. The point is for the word to spread so that the kinds of people Quincy was referring to at the end of the call, the people who may be in desperate situations in Central American countries, know what the risks are, not only from the coyotes and other unsavory characters as he identified them, but also that this kind of separation or just not being allowed entry is going to happen.
Yes, I think that is clearly an explicit part of this policy, although Secretary Nielsen claimed otherwise yesterday. A few hours later, Jeff Sessions went on TV on Fox News and said, yes, this is a deterrent. This is supposed to be, he didn't use these exact words, but this is supposed to be so painful, essentially, that people won't come here, no matter how desperate their situation is, whether they're being politically prosecuted or hunted down by gangs or their children have been recruited into gangs, et cetera.
And then to go back to Quincy's call, as he said, a hardcore administration, I guess the moral question becomes, okay, a country has a right to have borders and to defend its borders and to not let people just flow across the border, except as determined by U.S. law. But what is the line morally that a country shouldn't cross in order to send that deterrent message? And I think that's really the point that people are debating right now. The Trump immigration policies in general are being hotly debated and have been for a year and a half, 2 years. It was June of 2015 that he started his campaign, right? So we are 3 years since he came down the steps of Trump Tower and started his presidential campaign by saying Mexico isn't sending their best, they're rapists, they're drug dealers. I assume some are nice people. Mm-hmm. So 3 years of this. But on the larger immigration policies, the debate goes on. On this, as a deterrent, there's a new moral question.
Well, look, there are a few things to unpack here. One is that the numbers of illegal immigrants have been falling in the last, basically since the Great Recession. They have been falling.
But let me jump in on that because, since the Great Recession, I see you're talking about that long a period of time, 10 years. Mm-hmm. But the number of illegal crossings last year was apparently down even from what it had been the year before. And then this year it's back up. And that's one of the reasons they're doing this. And apparently Trump was really angry at Homeland Security Secretary Nielsen for allowing that to happen because the border is under her purview. Yes,
but even so, we need to remember that it's not like Trump likes to conflate all sorts of immigrants. Everybody's a member of MS-13 in his mind, it seems. But it's not just illegal immigrants that they're going after. We're talking about legal immigrants as well. And this administration and members of Congress, for that matter as well, have been trying their darndest to reduce numbers of legal immigrants too. And the people who are applying for asylum, again, many of them are trying to come here legally. So this idea that we're facing this overwhelming flow of illegal immigrants and they're just taking over our country, I think is incredibly misguided and misleading. And what you have going on is the administration, again, trying to conflate all these various groups, make people feel like they're in danger. As to the question of what is our moral obligation, I don't think anybody is arguing for open borders, despite what Secretary Nielsen said yesterday. She said, the only alternative to separating families is open borders. That's what the other side says. That's just not true. There are ways to have a secure border, to process people who are applying for asylum much more quickly than we currently do. I think there's something like a backlog of like 60,000 people, I don't know what the number is, who are currently applying for asylum. So we could devote more resources to that. There are plenty of ways to, enforce the law without separating babies from their parents. You could keep families together in detention. This is what previous administrations had done, and that what this administration has decided not to do, even after parents have been released in many cases from jail. So let's say you have crossed the border unlawfully, and some people obviously do, and then try to apply for asylum. The parents go to jail. They're charged with a misdemeanor. Let's say they're convicted. There have been lots of cases, including, again, in this ACLU lawsuit, where the parents are released from jail and the kids have been sent off to some center thousands of miles away and they can't get them back. So there are a lot of ways that we could improve upon this system that do not constitute creating open borders that would fulfill the law. And, we can argue about where the line is in terms of our moral obligations to people who are in desperate situations. But I think it is clearly immoral to be taking babies that are breastfeeding from their mothers.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC, live in the Greene Space today. Our first guest, Washington Post columnist Catherine Rampell. And let's take a call on line 9 from Doc in Queens. Doc, you're on WNYC. Thank you for calling.
Yes, thank you for having me. Yes, I was calling to throw a scenario to parents children being taken away from their parents, and that something came into my mind, a situation like when browns and blacks are being shut down in the street. That's being taken away from their children. To me, that's a similar scenario.
Doc, thank you very much. I will point out, as I do, when callers tell the screeners one thing and go on the air and say something else, that he told our screeners he's a conservative Republican and supports the policy.
I will point out, by the way, one of our earlier callers had said that he was disenchanted with Trump, that he had sort of been won over and then changed his mind because of this family separations policy. I'm not sure how representative he is. And well, maybe if he considers himself an independent, but there were 2 polls that came out yesterday that found that a majority of Republicans are in support of this policy.
Right. Well, in fact, that was one of the other things I was going to bring up. 66% in the new Quinnipiac poll disapprove of the separation policy, including 70% of women, but 55% of Republicans do approve. And Trump's overall approval rating in the new Gallup poll has risen to the highest level of his presidency, 45%, which, by the way, and for those who see this president as such an outlier, this may be a shock, is right in line with other presidents' approval ratings at this point in their terms. So just after the 500-day mark, Barack Obama also 45%, Bill Clinton 44%. And analysts say this is possibly a North Korea summit bump right now, and the child separation issue hasn't been factored in yet when those polls were taken the last few days. But still, the abnormal president is in the normal range.
Look, I think there are a few ways to explain this. One is the North Korea summit, which I'm not sure produced anything tangible, but I think people are maybe hopeful that there will be some progress that comes out of this. 2 is that the economy is doing well. I would point out that we're seeing basically a continuation of the exact same trends we saw for like the last 9 years in terms of the unemployment rate has been falling pretty much in a straight line. GDP growth is not so anomalous today relative to the trends we've seen before, et cetera. But nonetheless, the economy has been steadily improving. And if it gets better every day, you would think that people would feel better about the economy every day. And that may be boosting Trump's poll numbers. And then beyond that, I think there's just so much news. And despite the fact that much of the news is unflattering about Trump. There have been all of these scandals coming out of his administration, Scott Pruitt and others. You have the Mueller investigation turning up things that look not particularly good for Trump and those in his orbit. There's just so much to follow that I think it's hard to keep track for most people. I can barely keep track, and it's my job. So I think that to some extent he's proven a little bit resistant to all of this negative news.
And I think another possible conclusion or contributor is that the president may be abnormal, but the feelings of the people are not. It's a culture war that on some level has been going on since the 1960s, which we will talk about more with our next guests. And it's largely these days over immigration, largely over who Americans think does more harm than good. Certainly Trump's base seems to rally around him, around the Mueller investigation, as they believe the claims that it's illegitimate through various arguments and pieces of evidence. And it's about who feels included or alienated by the decisions of national leaders. It's tribal in that respect.
Yes, I think that there's to be clear, his disapproval ratings are still quite large. And I think the strong disapproval ratings are unusually high. I don't have the numbers in front of me. So even if his approval ratings are good, it's still maybe not, or it's still less than 50%, I guess. But so was the case with these other presidents.
Right, the disapproval was about 50%, which is very high. You know what? Let's take, I think, a real Republican who supports Trump. We'll try Anthony in Staten Island on line 3. Anthony, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hi, good morning, Brian. Thanks for taking my call. First and foremost, I'd like to say that the immigration system that we have currently in place is absolutely broken. It's been broken for decades. And I think we need to speak more about the lack of accountability on the part of our lawmakers to fix this. I can't say I agree with everything that President Trump is doing. I did vote for him. But first and foremost, I think the number one job of our lawmakers is to protect the legal citizens of the United States. And all too often, whenever we talk about immigration, we characterize it as immigration, not illegal immigration in this situation. But how much tolerance should we have? How much should it cost our taxpayers to process these folks? This is the greatest country on the face of the planet. When the colonists had issues with the way the colonies were being run, they stood up for themselves and they fought and they made changes, and that's what gave birth to this great country. So it has to be a multi-pronged approach. We have to see what's going on in these other countries, what's forcing these people to come to this country, and try to help resolve it that way. People are trying to get into this country by the hundreds of thousands, and hearing babies cry in the background, instead of sensationalizing that, I think we need to call our lawmakers into account and really try to fix it. Sit down and try to fix it.
And obviously there are a lot of opinions in Congress, and they haven't been able to come to yes on ways to fix it that satisfy varying constituencies. Anthony, is there not a point, though, at which you say, no, this is just too much. This is hard line. This makes our country something that it isn't, when Attorney General Sessions and the President are willing to go to this kind of extreme to create a deterrent?
Right. I don't want to. I really don't want to come off as an extremist, but the fact of the matter remains, and a lot of people are not going to like hearing it. These people are entering the country illegally. If you're trying to come into a country and you have to wait 3 days to be processed in the hot sun without food or water, that's really not my fault. It's not your fault. It's not the United States citizens' fault. These people are taking these risks.
And the fact that they're doing this with some people who are asking for asylum rather than just coming across illegally?
Brian, I've heard a lot of conflicting reports that there are criminals out there that are using children in order to get people across as a family unit when those people aren't even the parents of these children. It's really, the whole situation is disgusting. But to get back to your point, if you're crossing illegally, you are breaking the laws of the United States. It's a criminal act, and you're a criminal. So what's the difference between what these folks are doing and a normally law-abiding citizen making a mistake, getting arrested, and being separated from his or her family?
Anthony, I'm going to leave it there, and I thank you for your call, and please do call us again. And Catherine, of course, that raises the moral question in another way that people will have very strong reactions to, and so many people will say, no, this is not like somebody committing an ordinary crime. This is not like robbing a bank or, breaking into a home and burglarizing it or whatever, just walking across trying to get into the country to better your life. It may be illegal, but that it shouldn't be seen the same as other crime, which the administration is portraying it, as we heard in the clip from the Homeland Security Secretary.
Yeah, well, first of all, this would be a misdemeanor, and we do not have a zero tolerance policy for lots of other misdemeanors. I would also add that we were a party to the 1951 Refugee Convention, which specifically said that that countries should not prosecute refugees. This was after World War II, right? You should not prosecute refugees for unlawful presence. And that's what we're doing. So we're violating that convention. But beyond that, as I mentioned before, not all of these people are actually crossing unlawfully. They're still being separated from their kids. And I hear this analogy all the time, including from members of the administration and other people who support Trump, that that separating kids from their parents is no different from what we do for other kinds of criminals, for other kinds of crimes. But again, with other kinds of crimes, let's say that we are talking about people who crossed unlawfully, who committed a misdemeanor. With other kinds of crimes, once you're released from jail, you are reunited with your kid. Right? I mean, unless the kid the parent is unfit or the kid is in an unsafe situation, et cetera. But I'm saying, absent all of those factors, you are reunited with your kid. That's not what's happening here. What's happening here is that parents are getting released from jail. Their kids have already been sent off, and they wait sometimes months to be reunited. They have to file a court case in some of these situations where they have been successfully reunited. We don't know about what's happened to the rest. The system is not set up. And I think some of this may not be deliberate, that we're trying to keep parents who are out of the criminal justice system away from their kids if they have crossed the border unlawfully. I think some of it's just like these various departments are not set up to process these thousands of families, and kids are being sent all over the country, and it's hard to track where they are. It's hard to get them back to the parents, even when the parents are out of federal custody, they're out of jail, they're out of immigration detention centers, et cetera. It's difficult to reunite them. So again, this is not comparable to how we treat other crimes.
We're going to take a short break, and then we're going to come back and continue here in the Greene Space with Washington Post columnist Catherine Rampell. Some of you may know that she comes out of business reporting originally, and she's a business and economics as well as political columnist for the Washington Post. And we're going to turn to the other big story breaking this morning, which is stock markets in this country and around the world have been roiled this morning by the escalating trade war between the United States and China. So stay with us. We'll talk about that as we continue. Brian Lehrer Show, live from the Greene Space today on WNYC.
What's up with American boys?
The first conversation is an acknowledgement that something's wrong. To say there is something wrong, there is something broken in American straight white boys, and the result of that is that people are dying.
Comedian Michael Ian Black is talking about what's wrong with masculinity, and he's not laughing. I'm Tanzina Vega, and that's next time on The Takeaway, weekday afternoons at 3 on 93.9 FM.
Support for WNYC comes from Stealth Communications, providing gigabit-speed internet connections to businesses over its own completely fiber-optic network in New York City. More information at stealth.net. The Vital Projects Fund and the Museum of Modern Art, where Adrian Piper, A Synthesis of Intuitions, 1965 to 2016, is now on view. More info and tickets at MoMA.org. Leadership support for the Jerome L. Greene Performance Space is provided by the Jerome L. Greene Foundation.
If you believe democracy requires a free press, your station is WNYC, 93.9 FM and AM 820, NPR News and the New York Conversation.
on WNYC, live from the Greene Space today, where you can't stop the audience members from talking to each other. Human beings, they will talk. Catherine Rampell, Washington Post columnist, has stimulated them into conversation with each other. And those of you listening on the radio should know that you can also watch us when we're live in the Greene Space. We are streaming live audio on the homepage, live video, I should say, on the homepage at WNYC.org. Also on the WNYC Facebook page. That's another place that you can see live Greene Space streaming video of the Brian Lehrer Show today. Let's go on to tariffs, Catherine. When we last looked, just before we went on, the Dow was down over 300 points this morning, which has wiped out the bit of gain so far for the year. So the Dow is now, maybe just a few points in negative territory for 2018. There were some really big declines, like 4% in one case, I forget which country, overnight on some of the Asian exchanges, because while most of the media coverage the last few days has been about this parent and child separation policy, there's also been an escalating trade war. Trump and China are going back and forth. With your business and economics reporting background, give us some context about what's happening.
Here's how I would characterize what's been going on. China has been a bad actor, specifically when it comes to intellectual property. So if you want to do business in China, if you're an American company or European company or an Australian company or whatever, you have to partner most of the time with a Chinese firm. You have to transfer your technology to that Chinese firm. There have been other kinds of violations of intellectual property rights or sort of strong arming in terms of giving over that IP. So it's not wrong to say that China has behaved badly. What is probably wrong to do is to respond to that through massive tariffs and to start a trade war, which is essentially what we have been doing. Trump had initially announced $50 billion worth of tariffs. Last night, he announced another $200 billion worth of tariffs. Collectively, that represents about half of the imports that come in from China. And I think he believes that China will just cave. And will say, okay, we're going to do whatever you say, Mr. Trump, Mr. President, and Trump is more fixated on the deficit, the trade deficit, than the IP stuff, which is the actual violation, but whatever. I think instead what we're likely to see is more retaliation from China, which could take various forms. They could raise more tariffs on American goods, which they have already announced their intention to do from the previous round of tariffs. And they've been quite strategic about what kinds of goods they have been targeting. Things like Iowa pork, ginseng that comes from, I think, Paul Ryan's district in Wisconsin or somewhere nearby. Soybeans.
He's
also
done anyway.
Right, exactly. So maybe it's not as potent right now. But soybeans, lots of products that are politically sensitive. And again, we have a midterm coming up. They do not, interestingly enough. So they have a bit more leverage in that respect than we do. And there are lots of other things that they could do beyond tariffs at this point to make American companies' lives quite miserable.
So how do you see the end game according to Trump? I know you can't read his mind, but here's this
if only.
art of the deal guy who obviously has a chaos and conflict theory of negotiating. When there are tough negotiating partners, we see how he dealt with Kim Jong-un from the beginning, and that seems to have gotten him somewhere. We don't know how that's going to wind up, but it's gotten him somewhere. And is he doing something like that with China, where you can see a negotiated endpoint from what he's trying to do that isn't just him misreading the situation because he doesn't understand the politics?
I think he doesn't understand the politics, and he doesn't terribly well understand trade. Like I said, he's very fixated on the trade deficit, which is determined by lots of factors beyond, who's winning and losing and who's making good deals, including what savings and investment levels are in various countries. I think he's he's misguided on a number of different levels. What he should be doing, and what some members of his administration have even advocated, some of whom publicly, like Larry Kudlow, who's the head of his National Economic Council, is we should be banding together with other countries that have been similarly victimized, if you will, to use a more colorful term, by these IP policies that China has. We should be banding together with Japan and our allies in Australia and Canada and Mexico, et cetera, and saying, okay, we are going to create a coalition of the willing, and we are going to use multilateral pressure to get China back in line. And in fact, we had a way to do that. It was called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It was negotiated under President Obama, and when Trump came into office, he killed it. That would be the way to go about doing this. Of course, it's much more difficult now to switch gears to that strategy, in part because we've already alienated all of those allies through other tariffs, other trade wars that we are trying to launch at this point. So I think it'll be challenging. I don't see how these escalating tariffs on both sides, both coming from the United States and China, will get us to a situation that either country benefits from.
I want to play one more clip, and this is on another topic that the president brought up yesterday, and it's in a way consistent with what you were just talking about, even though it's about something wholly different. The president doesn't seem to like international institutions. I think there was a quote, I don't think he said it on tape. Are you familiar with what I'm talking about? It might have even been a Washington Post report. I think he was leaving Singapore after the summit with Kim Jong-un, where he was quoted as saying he doesn't really like international rules. So whether it's trade agreements that are multinational or, things that are more on the human rights side, whatever, he doesn't like the whole notion of international institutions. And maybe that somewhat plays into why he, in the middle of everything else that's going on, decided that he was going to propose this yesterday. Maybe some of you have heard it. Trump yesterday actually proposed a new branch of the United States military, the U.S. Space Force.
The essence of the American character is to explore new horizons and to tame new frontiers. But our destiny beyond the Earth is not only a matter of national identity, but a matter of national security. So important for our military, so important, and people don't talk about it. When it comes to defending America, it is not enough to merely have an American presence in space. We must have American dominance in space. So important. Very importantly, I'm hereby directing the Department of Defense and Pentagon to immediately begin the process necessary to establish a Space Force as the sixth branch of the armed forces. That's a big statement. We are going to have the Air Force and we are going to have the Space Force, separate but equal.
He got that phrase from somewhere in American history. Not exactly sure where. But this is part of his nationalist project, politically speaking, right? This is another thing that's probably supposed to land with the base. And you tweeted this morning, I saw that the Defense Secretary, Jim Mattis, had spoken previously against a separate United States Space Force. What do you know?
So Mattis had sent a letter to lawmakers, I think last fall, sometime last year, in which he urged them to strongly reconsider any interest in creating a separate Space Force. He said it was premature to come up with something like this, and he was too busy trying to reduce overhead in other ways and essentially suggesting this would create more overhead. So I should say I am not an expert in, space politics or space defense. I don't even know how you would characterize this, but Mattis knows a lot more about this than I do. He is Trump's own cabinet member, and he had opposed this quite publicly. So I do wonder what kind of discussions, if any, went on in this White House about this proposal. Yeah.
Do you know, and I'm not going to linger on this because this is neither of our expertise, but do you happen to know what the vision for a Space Force is? Is it satellites orbiting that are armed, that are staffed with human beings?
We already have satellites. I think that the details at this point are pretty vague. So
he just wants to gin up some Star Wars nationalism.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, maybe he likes the costumes or something. I don't know. Look, not to minimize this, but I don't know exactly what the strategy is here. I think you're right that this is thematically a piece with some of these other kinds of policies that we're talking about that suggest that Trump is much more interested in going it alone than having multilateral alliances of any kind. That is true in his defense policy, it's true in his trade policy, and various other kinds of arenas in which we would probably benefit from teaming up with allies as we have in the past.
He did say he wants to protect the country from aliens. So.
Did he? I missed that. Well, which kind of aliens, I think, is the question.
I think we have one question here in the Greene Space ready to go. Who is that? Hi.
Hi, Brian. My name's Tav. I'm from Manhattan, but I lived in California for many years, and I worked with many of the immigrant community that have been demonized recently. I worked with many people from Mexico, Central America, and South America. And I would just like to defend them by saying that they are the most upstanding, family value, church-going people I've ever had the pleasure of knowing. Many of them I consider my very best friends. My question from a business standpoint is that President Obama was trying to get away from privatized prisons. The Republicans and Donald Trump took many contributions from that industry. Is this an attempt to fill detention centers, privately run detention centers, with business? If you suddenly make a category of crossing the border a prisonable offense, you have just handed hundreds of thousands of customers to the private prison industry.
I don't know that that's the motivation. It may be an added benefit to the extent that this industry has been supportive of the administration. I think really the motivation is xenophobia, demonizing immigrants. And also, by the way, you know, talking about a business angle to this, I wanted to mention one point that came up from a caller earlier about how it's costing us all of this money to deal with all of these illegals or whatever. You know, if you look at the actual data, people who are undocumented pay more in taxes than they consume in government services. So again, this is sort of a tangent to what we're talking about, but I think this is a talking point that gets repeated a lot, you know, suggesting that these people who are coming here are a drain on the U.S. government, and at least at the federal level, that is not true. But I don't know the answer about private prisons. And
another comment in the Greene Space, or a question. Hi.
Hi, my name's Dawn. I'm so excited. I call you like weekly, and I'm so happy to be finally getting through. I'm so happy you brought that up vis-a-vis both your point and to that same caller's point. How can we as citizens deal with the quality of information? So often, it strikes me that one of the most dangerous problems occurring in our democracy presently is quality of information, which is motivating the choices people are making in elections. In my own family, extended family, I deal with this problem, just false, just unequivocally false information. And it's very difficult to talk to people about these issues when they're just wrong. And I mean, and I don't want to, you know, there's that liberal elitism. I'm from LA. I've been in New York for 14 years, and I want to be sensitive, but given your expertise, do you have any advice for us as to how to maybe guide people toward more reliable sources?
I think it's a very challenging question. And to be clear, I think it's not just a problem with people on some fringe of the right. There are people in blue cities who are vastly uninformed, who get wrong information. You know, lots of information tends to go viral, and I think that's no accident that false information goes viral. The fact that it's false means that it's often more sensational. So of course people are going to want to share it. You know, there were these photos of children in cages that were taken under the Obama administration that got rapidly shared as evidence that Trump was treating immigrants badly. It turns out he's also putting immigrants in cages. But in any case, you know, there's a lot of misinformation on both sides. And I don't exactly know what the solution is. I wish I had a fix. I think it would be very good for democracy if I did. That the best advice that I can give is try to be a savvy consumer, try to read primary documents if you can. Make sure you pay attention to the date on various articles. This is a simple thing, but that's part of the reason why stories get shared that are taken out of context, that are not quite right. You know, there was a lot of conflation of the missing children, for the missing immigrant children, which was actually that particular report was, again, something that had happened under Obama. Doesn't mean it's not still happening now, but there was this conflation of, well, the families are being separated at the border and then the kids are immediately being lost, relying on data from the Obama administration. So I think the best advice I have is to read a lot of different sources, try to be critical in terms of thinking through the kinds of arguments that are made, look at primary documents if you can.
And even just spend a little time to determine some media sources whose news you trust. Yes. And if you're trying to convince a relative, for example, look at the citations that those media sources cite. So if you read a Catherine Rampell column or most things in the Washington Post, they're usually going to cite where, let's say, statistics about how immigrants contribute more to the economy than they take, or whatever it might be, come from. And then you might scramble somebody's brain by presenting it to them really nicely.
Yeah, that's been my main tactic, is just encouraging, like, gently source your sources. And I wonder if also for those savvy with social media to sort of counterbalance, as you said, fringy, difficult information on both sides, encouraging more solid folks that are on Twitter that are more reliable, and like pushing those and doing what we can to make people like you and others go viral, if you will.
Thank you very much. And listeners and Greene Space audience, please thank Washington Post columnist Catherine Rampell. Brian Lehrer on WNYC, live in the Greene Space today, and it's time for the latest news, doing maybe her first live newscast before a studio audience, Carrie Nolan.
Thanks, Brian. China is seeking to highlight its role in nuclear talks with North Korea by hosting leader Kim Jong-un to discuss the follow-up to his summit with President Trump. Washington has long looked to Beijing to use its influence as a strong ally of North Korea, but the visit comes as U.S.-China ties are being tested by a major trade dispute. And those trade tensions between the U.S. and China continue to escalate, with threats from President Trump of a new 10% tariff on $200 billion in Chinese imports, and Beijing calling the action blackmail. China says if the U.S. goes through with its plan, it can expect, quote, strong countermeasures of the same amount and quality. Wall Street has viewed the escalating trade tensions with wariness. The Dow was down 350 points in early trading. A bill barring drilling for offshore oil in New York state waters is one step closer to becoming law. The Assembly passed the Save Our Waters bill last night. It would prohibit the leasing of lands for offshore drilling and exploration within the state. Governor Andrew Cuomo praised the move by the Assembly and said he hopes the Senate approval of the bill will follow quickly. This is the latest move by an East Coast state to counter the Trump administration's plan to open nearly all offshore waters to drilling. New Jersey passed its own ban back in April. New York State's health commissioner says he supports legalizing recreational marijuana. Commissioner Howard Zucker's office was tasked with studying the impact of legalization by Governor Cuomo earlier this year. Zucker says he plans to deliver his final report soon, but his findings are definitive.
We realize that the pros outweigh the cons, and that the report recommends that a regulated, legal marijuana program be available to adults in the state of New York.
Zucker also announced an expansion of the state's medical marijuana program. He says the health department will change its regulations so doctors can recommend medical marijuana instead of opioids for a range of conditions. Additional details will be released in the coming weeks. 6 New Jersey clergy members who were arrested in February during a sit-in at Congressman Leonard Lance's office are headed back to court today. Rabbi Elliot Tepperman from Montclair says the group plans to plead not guilty for defiant trespassing. He says he believes their protests matter now more than ever because of today's political climate.
We are living in a moment that requires all citizens to be doing everything that they can to protect their neighbors and protect the immigrants who are among us, and to demand that everyone who has power, and in particular our public officials, stand up for what is right.
Tepperman says no matter the outcome of today's ruling, the group plans to continue protesting the White House's immigration policies, including its efforts to rescind DACA and the controversial policy of separating immigrant children from parents at the border. And jury selection is set to begin today in the retrial of former New York State Senate leader Dean Skelos and his son on corruption charges. Skelos and his son Adam were convicted in 2015 on charges of extortion, conspiracy, and bribery. Dean Skelos was sentenced to 5 years in prison. His son got 6 years. A federal appeals court later tossed out the conviction, citing a Supreme Court ruling that narrowed the legal definition of corruption. And it'll be warm and a bit on the humid side today with highs near 90 degrees. Right now it's 82 degrees. And that's the latest from the WNYC newsroom. I'm Carrie Nolan.
Eddie Wise and his wife were black farmers in North Carolina. Eddie says a government agency discriminated against them for years and drove them off their land.
Deputy Coney with the Marshal Service, you obviously know what's going on.
So I'm supposed to take my wife and just walk off?
Yes, sir. Unfortunately, that's the order from the court.
On the next Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting and PRX. Tonight at 8 on 93.9 FM, WNYC.
WNYC is supported by Brooklyn Museum. Happening now, David Bowie is exploring 5 decades of the pioneering artist's career within an immersive multimedia installation. The exhibition ends on July 15th. Learn more at brooklynmuseum.org. Brandeis University, saluting the class of 2018, graduates with passion and intellect who are committed to making the world a better place. More information at brandeis.edu. The International Rescue Committee, through the support of its friends. Founded in New York City, the IRC works to help those devastated by conflict and disaster. June 20th is World Refugee Day. More at rescue.org. WNYC is a media partner of Strand Bookstore, presenting author Terrence Hayes and poet Mary Carr discussing their latest books of poetry. June 21st in the Rare Book Room. Info at strandbooks.com.
This is WNYC FM HD and AM New York, WNJT FM 88.1 Trenton, WNJP 88.5 Sussex, WNJY 89.3 Netcong, and WNJO 90.3 Toms River. We are New York and New Jersey Public Radio. Brian Lehrer with you live in the Greene Space today. Our Greene Space audience, you were able to see that I have, even after all this time, not memorized the full legal ID as I was reading all those little New Jersey stations off my iPad. Listeners, we are live in the Greene Space today, and when we are live in the Greene Space, you can watch the Brian Lehrer Show as well as listen. So if you want to watch live streaming video, you can do that at WNYC.org. We have it right on the homepage of our website or on the WNYC Facebook page as well. Now, we're just about done with our series, The Eights, A Brief History of the Culture Wars, decade by decade, starting with 1948 we've spent the last 6 weeks playing historical audio and speaking with guests and taking your oral history calls to help reconstruct some of how we got to this place of such intense polarization and alienation as we are in today. So here in 2018, the very latest polls show it over the issue of separating children from their parents at the border if the parents cross illegally, as we discussed in our segment before the news. And again, Trump's overall approval rating in the new Gallup poll is right in line with other presidents' approval ratings at this point in their terms, just after the 500-day mark. Obama also 45%, Bill Clinton 44%. The abnormal president is in the normal range. And one possible conclusion is that the president may be abnormal by historical standards, but the feelings of the people are not. There's a culture war that's been going on since the 1960s is one way to look at it. We could go back even much further to look at it another way, but it's largely over who Americans think does more harm than good and who feels included or alienated by the decisions of national leaders. So today and tomorrow we will wrap up this series with some concluding thoughts and the results of a survey we produced with the Harris poll in conjunction with the series. We'll get to the poll in a minute, but let me pull out just a couple of history clips that we played earlier. One is an expanded version, and say our country faces a stark choice about which America we want to be. I'm going to play Pat Buchanan from the 1992 Republican Convention and Barack Obama from the 2004 Democratic Convention. Buchanan in 92, after running against the first President Bush in the primaries and losing, obviously, had his most famous moment, the Pat Buchanan Culture War speech.
There is a religious war going on in this country. It is a cultural war as critical to the kind of nation we shall be as the Cold War itself, for this war is for the soul of America. And in that struggle for the soul of America, Clinton and Clinton are on the other side, and George Bush is on our side.
And what were some elements of that culture war, according to Pat Buchanan?
The agenda that Clinton and Clinton would impose on America. Abortion on demand, a litmus test for the Supreme Court, homosexual rights, discrimination against religious schools, women in combat units. That's change, all right. But that's not the kind of change America needs. It's not the kind of change America wants. And it's not the kind of change we can abide in a nation we still call God's country.
So that was Buchanan in 92. Interesting that in both those excerpts, he didn't just say Bill Clinton, he said Clinton and Clinton. So already, not even being a candidate for anything, Hillary Clinton was a culture war devil and used that way by that side. So he was speaking to the alienation of the American cultural right. And he lost the primaries, but validated a certain kind of culture wars passion that predated Clinton-Lewinsky and predated NAFTA and predated the last 25 years of large-scale immigration. None of that had happened in 1992. It was there since the 60s, and in a way, since before the Civil War, for Pat Buchanan to stoke and stroke, and it dogged Bill Clinton his whole 8 years. So along came Barack Obama in 2004.
E pluribus unum, out of many, one. Now, even as we speak, there are those who are preparing to divide us. The spin masters, the negative ad peddlers, who embrace the politics of anything goes. Well, I say to them tonight, there is not a liberal America and a conservative America. There is the United States of America. There is not a black America and a white America and Latino America and Asian America. There's the United States of America.
And maybe that sounds a little naive through the lens of 2018. But which America do we want to have? Maybe our fate as a country is to ride that wave back and forth between cultural fight club and the desire for resolution. And today, obviously, we have the closest thing to Pat Buchanan as president as we've ever had in modern times. Weird that it comes after Obama not only got elected, but reelected. It could actually be that McCain and Romney weren't culture warriors enough to maximize Republican turnout, while Obama's no red America, no blue America, post-baby boom, post-culture wars, post-partisan, post-race, also failed to bridge the gap. So our goal with the Harris poll was to learn from a wide cross-section of Americans, this is a national poll, about some things that unite us and some things that divide us, and look for opportunities to move forward more as one country while respecting people's differences and how alienated different groups of Americans can feel, often for legitimate reasons. In fact, almost every year since 1966, the Harris poll has published what they call an alienation index, the results of a survey intended to see how alienated people are from the elites, if you want to put it that way, or leadership in this country. And little history, the alienation index went up steadily during the Obama years. That's not to say the president was necessarily to blame, but alienation rose from 2009 to 2014, stayed at that peak through 2016, and actually came down a little during the first year of the Trump administration. On the scale they have of 1 to 100, the alien index was 29 when it started out in 1966. It rose steadily for the next decade, the divisive Vietnam and Watergate and counterculture years, and basically never recovered, staying in the 50s and 60s out of 100 ever since. And during Obama, the alienation was 52 in 2010, 63 in 2011, 67 in 2013, and a record high of 70 in 2014 and 2016. It came down, though just a bit, to 67 last year, the first year of President Trump. We will look more closely at those numbers as we bring in our guests. Michael D'Antonio, executive editor of the Harris Poll and author of books including The Athena Doctrine, How Women and the Men Who Think Like Them Will Rule the Future. He also wrote The Truth About Trump and has a forthcoming book about Mike Pence called The Shadow President. And for another set of academic eyes on these results, Christina Greer, Fordham political science professor and author of the book Black Ethnics, Race, Immigration, and the Pursuit of the American Dream. Christina and Michael, welcome back to WNYC.
Thanks, Brian.
Good morning.
And before we get to the new poll, Michael, let's look at what it was meant to build on. I've been laying out for the listeners a bit of the history of the Harris Alienation Index, which is based on the scores people give to 5 alienation statements. The people running the country don't really care what happens to you. The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Most people in power try to take advantage of people like you. What you think doesn't count very much anymore, and you are left out of things going on around you. What are those questions trying to get at?
I think they're trying to get at people's sense of of agency in the world and in their lives. Do they feel powerful in a way as citizens? And it's a measure of well-being. My own sense of well-being might be determined by my sense of control and whether these systems that seem so broad actually respond to me. And we have found over the years that this varies a lot by who's in power at the moment and who we're polling. So if you're polling the general population and there's this division politically, we would see that, for example, during the Obama administration, that white conservatives became ever more alienated, especially rural white conservatives. But then it also spilled into people who identified as Democrats and people who identified as Obama voters. There's also, I think, something that began to happen in the 60s and accelerated in the 70s, and that was the active manipulation of people's sense of well-being. the mass media that existed after World War II started to reach into people's lives in a new way. You didn't have to sit down and consider something in the newspaper. You could sort of take it in passively through the television. And both political parties started to exploit anxieties, especially in the 60s and 70s. With Nixon's Southern strategy, which was first employed in 68 and then in 72 more aggressively, this idea that whites were somehow losing as others may gain started to take hold. And so one of the things that popped out to me was how idealistic Americans were during the 70s. People went from believing that what made America great was equal opportunity, getting along with other nations, free education, and a higher standard of living in the 70s, to completely materialistic views of what would make America great going forward after 78. It was all about how hard you worked, natural resources, industrial know-how, and military strength. So you could see that there was a window in the late 60s when people did feel less alienated, felt like there were these ideals they could aspire to, but that sense of good feeling was lost.
So a country with an overall 70% alienation index is a pretty darn alienated country, and is likely to be a country at war with its elites in particular. And here's a little deeper dive. In the later Obama years, Republicans, as you might imagine, felt the most alienated, but Democrats felt what Harris calls the most isolated. There was little difference by age group and little difference by gender, so alienation tended to run along these party lines, which these days is increasingly a proxy for race. The roles dramatically flipped last year, with Democrats now feeling more alienated with a 67 alienation index, and Republicans down at 51. And that is a really dramatic finding here to my eye. The alienation among Republicans plummeted from 69 in the year before the election to 51 a year after the election, while Democrats didn't even go up. It remained about as alienated as before, around 67 out of 100. And alienation among men dropped more than among women, not surprisingly under Trump, an 8-point improvement, but alienation among women still went down 4 points as well, meaning Trump even made Republican women, I guess, Michael, feel more included on average.
Well, and what's important to consider about this is, could lives have changed so substantially in the first year of the Trump administration that this would be based on something real and concrete in people's lives? The answer obviously is no, but
well, at least his attitude and his speech.
The symbols of power changed. And what you noted about people's anxieties about the elite is fascinating to consider, because Trump came from an incredibly elite background, Ivy educated, a billionaire, depending on whether you believe him.
I don't.
Perhaps one time, maybe 10 times over. And yet the vision of this person in the White House did make many people feel less alienated. And I think that should make us ask, what was it about his predecessor that made so many people uncomfortable?
So, Christina, as it turns out, in this case, well, you could take that if you want.
I mean, I just think it's a one-word answer, racism. I mean, this is a country, we have to remember, just because Democrats did an 8-year victory lap patting themselves on the back that they elected a black man, we still have to remember, we lost state houses, we lost governorships. I mean, there were a lot of things that were in motion
Democrats did all that time.
All during the 8 years of Obama and even before. And I always remind people, I'm like, this is still a country that has 4 pillars, and that's capitalism, anti-black racism, white supremacy, and patriarchy. And they came in this beautiful package called Donald Trump, but they were never gone. So when people say, this isn't the country we know, it is. Read a book. I mean, so when we say, when we say, okay, Republican women, this is, obviously when we think about intersectionality, we're saying white women. for the most part. So when it's just like, okay, well, women are feeling less alienated. Well, white women are feeling less alienated because we know that white women in many ways, especially white Republican women, have been the keepers of patriarchy through time, right? So none of this stuff is new. I think it's just the way in the 21st century that we've seen racism on display. And so I thought that these results were interesting for sure, but we know that for a lot of white Americans, Democrats and Republicans, equity equals discrimination. So in trying to level a playing field, many people feel as though something's being taken away, even if nothing's being taken away. It's just this perception of I'm actually trying to pull in more people to have an equitable experience in America.
One piece of pushback that some people would say to that, to some of what you said, is that, but wait, we didn't only elect Obama, we re-elected Obama. So what does that say about racism in white America?
I think that, looking at a lot of the Obama voters who then turned around and voted for Trump, I think that Obama was an aspirational figure in the same way that Trump is an aspirational figure. And so I would ask people from the cities or the coast, as we say, to drive across the country and see sort of the destitute situations that many Americans, not just white Americans, but Americans full stop, are in. And I think Obama's message of hope sort of did carry over enough in 2012. And so then Trump came. Keep in mind, he had a 40-year head start. He was in Ghostbusters too. Like, he's been in our homes for a really long time, like he's been on The Apprentice as this aspirational billionaire who I think he's a thousandaire, but we haven't seen his taxes, so how would I know? But I think a lot of people saw him as this aspirational figure, and then a lot of other people, he said a lot of things that people have been thinking for a very long time, which is, you don't have because someone else took it from you. Sort of, I call it the Archie Bunker narrative, right? You're mad that the Jeffersons move into your neighborhood. You're even more mad when they move out of your neighborhood and they're doing even better. And so Obama represented sort of not just blackness, but all the sort of black and brown and Asian folks in his set, and the women in his cabinet and sort of in his orb really did sort of start to weaken these pillars of white supremacy, anti-black racism, patriarchy, and capitalism. And so I think that's where we get this pendulum swing. I mean, we saw it with Dinkins to Giuliani, and we saw Giuliani troll Dinkins for 4 years, the same exact way that Trump trolled Obama for 8 years. And so if we look around the country, and mayors, especially black mayors who are then succeeded by sort of, I would call racist white mayors, it's a pattern that this country has had in quite some time. And we've seen it sort of with gender, and we've seen it with race.
So now to our new poll. We tested a number of things based on the recent news to see what made people feel more included and what made people feel less included. That is, to see, while we are stuck in our political tribes, where some opportunities might be for easing alienation, easing the culture wars, and finding points of common ground, as well as to see where some major divisive fault lines are. So we'll present our findings over 2 days, today and tomorrow, focusing today more on things that unite us, according to these numbers, and tomorrow more on the findings of things that divide us. Now, as an overview, some unity items were making healthcare more affordable, being more open to alternative viewpoints, being involved more in your local community, and having more things for sale that were made in America. Those all drew really high scores of more than 80% of respondents saying those things would make them feel more included. Also in the 80% or higher range, if there was less discrimination based on people's identities or beliefs, if women had substantially more power and respect in society, even 72% of men said that, and more power and respect for African Americans, tested almost as well in the high 70s. Even 70% of whites said they would feel more included if African Americans had more power. But maybe that's just what many people thought the pollsters wanted to hear,
Right.
Because the idea of social justice was much more divisive by race than more power for women or blacks was. Maybe that phrase doesn't test well simply, but when asked if more social justice movements like Black Lives Matter and Me Too, both of those were cited in the question, would have a positive or negative impact on society, 70% of African Americans said positive to just 47% of whites, a whopping 30 points less. And immigration also breaks along racial lines We'll talk a lot about that tomorrow. And half of white Americans, 50%, said Black Lives Matter is doing more harm than good. Only 14% of blacks said that. So, Michael, can we drill down on some of the specifics? What struck you about things that polled really high as unifying items that would make people feel less alienated, more included, and what's just sort of an artifact of polling error?
Well, I think some of these views are an artifact of polling error and do indicate aspirational notions that people don't want to tell a pollster, no, I don't think more power in the hands of black people is a good idea. I think we should hold it ourselves as white people. That's just not going to come out. And this is why many election pollsters fail to call elections in cities effectively, because if a black candidate is strong, the whites will not say that they're going to vote against him or her. They just will do it. And so you wind up with election night results that are surprising. So, but this other issue of asking people, does the Black Lives Matter movement help or hurt? There we got a majority of whites saying that it hurts. It's a slim majority, but it was a majority. And this echoes what was revealed during the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. Whites were almost always against the Civil Rights Movement when polled. And there was even anxiety in the black community about certain leaders who were perceived as too strident, asking for too much, maybe posing a danger of a backlash. And life experience tells us that these backlashes do happen. So we're living through one right now. And that idea that you expressed of riding the wave in and out really is what we experience. The question then becomes, what do people really want? And I think the interesting response about they would feel more included in society if people were more open to alternative viewpoints and engaging others in meaningful debate. That was 82%. I suspect that a lot of it is people wanting others to listen to them. You know,
right. Rather than volunteering to listen to others.
One of the other things that was expressed as a very high value was if people were more involved in their local communities. That was 86%. Now, in New York City, that could mean being involved with the people on the floor of your apartment building. That could be your local community, and it could be very productive. But there's also an element of raising the drawbridge that people express when they're talking about their local communities. Local control became a stand-in for segregation after the 1950s, especially in school districts. So you have to dig beyond these responses, especially when they're big. When it's 82% saying people should listen to each other more, what are they really saying?
Yeah, and Christina, one way to look at this whole history of post-World War II America that we've been doing these last 6 weeks is that it's a history of social progress and backlash, and social progress and backlash.
Right, and I think also people liking things in theory. I mean, this is what Michael and I were talking about before we joined you. You know, the people who said that they want more community, I'm just going to take the Upper West Side, for example, right? Of course, they love diversity, but not when your kids are going to go to school with my kids. That's when the rubber hits the road, right? So in theory, yes, we want, to have these conversations. Can we really have a conversation if you're wearing a Make America Great Again hat? And we know that in high schools across the country, kids are doing that essentially because they can't wear a Confederate flag, right? Or if they're playing a Latino sports team, they'll just start chanting Trump because that means something. I would love to sort of dig through these results with sort of some follow-up qualitative interviews, because when we think about sort of health and wellness, we know that social scientists have polled different people that say, how do you feel about the Affordable Care Act? I love it. It's great. It's going to help me and my family. So how do you feel about Obamacare? The worst thing ever. I can't believe he's taking all of our tax money. So I mean, there is this racialized undercurrent to how we even conceptualize some of these concepts.
Well, and that difference does speak to the idea of political marketing, So everything was marketed as anti-Obama by one side of the debate over the Affordable Care Act, where people loved all the parts of it, but when it was attached to this figure, then it became a negative. And I think that one area where I think leadership has been lacking actually has been in the spiritual and religious community, because these aspirations that you're talking about are whispers from our higher selves, and who is amplifying those whispers and who is working to drown them out? If you're saying that there's a culture war and that this is God's country and you're defining what all those terms mean, are you providing the leadership that calls people to their higher selves, or are you being divisive?
But I think we can look at white evangelicals across the country who have supported this president, and I think that that's eroded the trust in what a spiritual leader means, right? So this is a man who can say Muslims, need to be banned from this country, just full stop. Mexicans are rapists. Black people should just be incarcerated. I mean, he has a special feeling towards black folks. But we see that these evangelicals have always sort of stood up for Trump and said, finally, we have such a morally guided man in the White House, thrice married,
But the new president of the Southern Baptist Convention is a young pastor who is in favor of doing something about climate change, who stood up against this policy on the border. There are young evangelicals who are rejecting this kind of leadership. And there's also a drop-off where some evangelical leaders are saying, we're killing the church. That if we tie ourselves to this politics too closely, we're going to lose our message of
because young people aren't in the church the way they have been in the past, and people in cities aren't as religious as other folks. It's one of the biggest stats, as we've been following some changing statistics in America decade by decade, that pops the most, is that in 1948, just 2% of Americans said they had no religion, religious identification in particular. One recent poll found that about 35% of millennials say that.
Mm-hmm. So then that begs the question of where have the leaders who would call people to an example of faith that is inspiring, where have they gone? Where are the people who are calling us to act on behalf of our brothers and sisters? I think...
Of course, religion is not the only source of that.
It isn't. But if people of faith abandon it, then I think that says a lot. And so far, I think that's the trend, is that people are abandoning that open vision of spirituality and religion.
With Michael D'Antonio from the Harris Poll and Christina Greer, Fordham political science professor, will continue in a minute from the Greene Space. Our phone number, 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692, or here in the audience, just raise your hand. Brian Lehrer on WNYC.
On the next Fresh Air, our guest will be David Sanger, author of The Perfect Weapon, War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age. He writes about the Russian hacking of the DNC, digital sabotage from Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, and how the U.S. is trying to defend itself. Sanger is a national security correspondent for the New York Times. Join us. Weekdays at 2 on 93.9 FM WNYC.
WNYC supporters include the New York Botanical Garden, kicking off its summer concert series on Friday, June 22nd. Live jazz on the conservatory lawn, followed by an evening viewing of the exhibition Georgia O'Keeffe, Visions of Hawaii. More at nybg.org. WNYC is a media partner of the New York Academy of Sciences, presenting Science Denialism, Public Policy, and Global Health, moderated by Ira Flato, host of Science Friday, on June 28th at 7 p.m. Details on this public program at nyas.org.
Celebrate the official start of summer at Brooklyn Bowl and support WNYC. Your favorite hosts will be there, including Brian Lehrer, Radiolab's Jad Abumrad, Kathy Tu and Tobin Lowe from the podcast Nancy, and me, John Schaefer. I'll interview members of Grizzly Bear, who will play live. And there'll be a lively round of Ask a Native New Yorker with Gothamist co-founder Jake Dobkin. Hope you can join us Thursday night at 8. Tickets at wnyc.org/events.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC, live in the Greene Space today with a very buzzy audience. Boy, you guys are prompting some conversation among the troops. So those of you listening alone out there, people listen to the radio alone. How do you all, those of you who came to the Greene Space, you're radio listeners, where do you listen? Do you listen in your kitchen, bathroom, somebody said? You listen in the car. Radio is such a solitary experience usually. So talk about building community. It's great to see so many people here in the Greene Space and that you are so buzzy during the breaks. We are wrapping up our series, The Eights, A Brief History of the Culture Wars, today and tomorrow with some concluding thoughts and the results of a new WNYC Harris poll we did in conjunction with the series on what unites us, who's doing more good or harm, what divides us, and what's going to make America great in the future compared to in the past. We're focusing on the more uniting findings today, the more dividing ones tomorrow. But to dip into the historical audio vault for just a second to get another example of how much things have changed. Right after World War II, when the Western Allies were bent on preventing anything as horrific again as a world war or the Holocaust, they started to set up international institutions and to talk in terms of international standards of behavior and global norms based on the notion of common humanity more than ever before. So 1948 was the year the World Trade Organization was established. I know, mixed results. And the year of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which human rights advocate and former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt celebrated upon its inception.
We stand today at the threshold of a great event, both in the life of the United Nations and in the life of mankind. This Universal Declaration of Human Rights may well become the international Magna Carta of all men everywhere.
How different from today, when the president could say this on Fox News Channel last week after meeting with Kim Jong-un.
He's the head of a country, and I mean he's the strong head. Mm-hmm. Don't let anyone think anything different. Right. He speaks and his people sit up at attention. I want my people to do the same.
So later a CNN reporter asked him,
what did you mean just now when you said you wished Americans would sit up at attention when you spoke?
I'm kidding. You don't understand sarcasm.
Okay, but even if he was kidding, certainly it's new in 2018 that an American president could make that kind of a joke about massively human rights violating heads of state. We're not in 1948 anymore, Mrs. Roosevelt. Still with us are two guests, Michael D'Antonio, executive editor of the Harris Poll and author of books including The Athena Doctrine, How Women and Men Who Think Like Them Will Rule the Future, The Truth About Trump, and a forthcoming book about Mike Pence called The Shadow President. And for another set of academic eyes on our poll results, Christina Greer, Fordham political science professor and author of Black Ethnics, Race, Immigration, and the Pursuit of the American Dream. And Christina, I actually want to take that Trump quip kind of seriously in the context of the culture wars and the Harris Poll Alienation Index, because I think, historically speaking, alienation works against a strong belief in democracy and for a willingness to identify with a strong man.
Right, and I think we have to go back to, some of the polls that were taken when Obama was president, and a lot of Republicans felt like we were losing our stature in the world, losing our stature to these immigrants, and they wanted sort of this big, strong dad figure, if you will, to come in. I think also we have to remember the vast majority of white people in America have never had a black boss, right, let alone a black friend. So they've had black people in their employ, but they've never had black leadership. And so that is something that collectively as a nation, we were detangling for 8 years. Trump then comes along and sort of, we have a conversation about Puerto Rico yesterday at the UN. The United States is not present. About Puerto Rico, right? Other countries are there, but we're not there because we walked away. Part of the rhetoric that he said when he descended that gold escalator in 2016 was that he didn't want the UN, right? He doesn't want to be a player internationally. And part of the problem now is that our international allies are going to figure out a world without us. Slowly but surely, Germany and England and France and lots of other former friends are saying, well, if you all are attaching yourselves with, Russia and North Korea and whomever else, we'll figure it out on our own. And so this Western alliance post-World War II is now something that I'm not going to say is dissolved, but is swiftly dissolving under this president.
Let's take a phone call. On line 10, David in Crown Heights. David, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. I was just responding to, I know we spoke about race and this kind of blowback from Obama to Trump, but also there's the economic factor, being we had this huge economic crash. People lost their livelihoods and all their savings, so we go for this billionaire who obviously is basking in this idea that he's the savior based on his business acumen. So, I mean, it seems not a coincidence to me that there is this connection between the economic crash and everybody's, new life, experiencing hardship, and this idea that he's going to be this white and also very, very rich savior of a businessman.
David,
thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'll tell a story. I was in Central Park playing softball in 2016, and this, I believe he was an African immigrant selling soda and other soft drinks and water in the park. That's how he was making his living. And he recognized me, and he said, "So, what do you think about Trump?" This is 2015. And I said, "Well, what do you think about Trump?" And he said, "Well, maybe he can create a lot of jobs." Mm-hmm. And it's considering the demographics and the time, and it was a salient story, and it never left me. Let's go to David in New Rochelle on line 9. David, you're on WNYC.
Hi, thanks, Brian. I'm just hoping that the next, Democrat who comes, is kind of the leader of the party, is able to, stand up for some of these social issues in a way that I don't feel like we've heard from the Democratic leadership since basically Obama, some of his speeches in 2008. I was sort of hoping when he was elected that we'd have more of a Bill Clinton who spoke out when Matthew Shepard was killed, and there was some atrocities in Texas. He would always be front and center speaking out on that, and I don't feel like that's happened the last 10 years. And I think in the void, and we can debate why, people like Coates and others have their theories that I subscribe to, but I feel like in the absence of that, in the void of that, we had someone step in and promulgate a lot of, terrible things that swung the hearts and minds of former Obama or Clinton voters. And, something my mom said to me in 2016 was, people don't know they're angry until you tell them that they're angry. So, I think people can be swung back if we have the right leadership. Pelosi, Schumer, and others, their silence is deafening in my eyes. And I just finished reading John McCain's book, and he speaks out in his book and a lot of things I think we would agree with on immigrants and, how they should be treated and how they actually contribute to our society. He speaks out more in his book than Democrats do, in my opinion. So I think we need a real look, and I'm hoping Tom Perez or others can really identify a leader who's aspirational.
David, thank you very much. It'll probably be more up to the people than the head of the Democratic Party, Tom Perez.
If we're waiting for Tom Perez, then we'll be waiting quite some time.
Let's take one more comment, then we're going to be out of time. Who in the Greene Space had your hand up? We have somebody here. Hi.
Thanks a lot, Brian. As you were rolling off that questionnaire of questions that constitute the alienation, I was kind of check. And my problem is with the media. The lady in the previous segment asked, who's reliable? Why won't we talk to the mainstream media? And my problem is with the mainstream media because I believe that they're not listening to the people. I believe that the stories that they're reporting are not all there is to report. And my personal experience is with the judicial system, where I went to court, I tried to sue, the judge quite simply, invented a totally bogus argument, replaced our argument with a totally bogus argument so as to decide the case the way they want to decide him. And time after time that happens, and finally I sued the judges, and I've been told that there is a case law that judges have the right to act maliciously and corruptly. And I just said, oh my goodness, if Trump tweeted tomorrow, I have the right to act maliciously and corruptly, the heaven, the sky's going to fall and all
Half the people would believe him.
So, but I am amazed that here we have a whole branch of U.S. government that says we have the right to act maliciously and corruptly. The press not only does not want to talk about it, on its own, but I go to the reporters, I talk to plenty of reporters, and they kind of look at me, are you nuts? And so I'm saying, yeah, of course I do not have agency. Here is this outrage, this total absolute outrage where we do not have due process, is happening in front of everybody's eyes. And judges are so corrupt that they openly say we are corrupt and malicious and we are within our rights.
Thank you, sir.
And yet the press does not want to talk. So
one alienated American is going to get just about our last word, except for the two of you. Just give me a soundbite on this because we're late for our next segment. Are we doomed, in your opinion, to have Pat Buchanan's America, where we just have to go back and forth and one side or another is going to win on culture war issues now and another time, and never to have Barack Obama's 2004 convention speech America?
Well, two things. One, I would say we need to also watch Jesse Jackson's 1988 convention speech and Al Sharpton's 2004 convention speech that happened 2 days prior to Obama's, which I think both of those are much more succinct and possibly better
right. And I will say we played an extended excerpt of the Jesse Jackson speech in this series.
Oh, good. Yes. I hope that we're not going to just swing the pendulum, but I do think that we have to remember, we were talking about this earlier, what LBJ said, he's like, if you convince the poorest white man that he's better than the Negro or immigrant or insert whatever 21st century name that you need to insert, it's like you can pick his pockets all day long. And I think that's what we're seeing right now with this particular administration, and I hope that the pendulum doesn't just swing back to sort of, a Democrat that's sort of in line with, progressivism, and then back to a hardcore Republican and this, that, and the other, because then we just have blue team versus red team.
Michael Short, and you're coming back tomorrow.
Well, I feel optimistic, actually. I think that our higher selves still reside inside of us, that it can be awakened, and I think it takes a lot of hard work to sustain progress, and we're being called to that hard work.
Part 2 of rolling out the WNYC Harris Poll at the end of our series, The Eights, with Michael D'Antonio and other guests tomorrow. See you then, executive editor of the Harris Poll, and we thank for partnering today Christina Greer, Fordham political science professor and author of Black Ethnics, Race, Immigration, and the Pursuit of the American Dream. Thank you both so much.
Thanks, Brian.
On WNYC, more to come.
What's up with American boys?
The first conversation is an acknowledgement that something's wrong. To say there is something wrong, there is something broken in American straight white boys, and the result of that is that people are dying.
Comedian Michael Ian Black is talking about what's wrong with masculinity, and he's not laughing. I'm Tanzina Vega, and that's next time on The Takeaway, weekday afternoons at 3 on 93.9 FM.
Support for WNYC comes from Capital One, which offers interest-bearing CDs, including the 12-month CD, available at a Capital One location. Cherry Lane Theater's First Love. A couple in their 60s fall in love for the first time in their lives and try to avoid sabotaging the last chance for love they'll ever have. Written by Charles Mee, directed by Kim Wield. Now on stage, cherrylanetheater.org. You value the programs you hear on WNYC. That's why you're listening right now. So are thousands of others, people who would learn about your business on our air. Learn more about corporate sponsorship at wnyc.org/sponsor.
WNYC, independent journalism in the public interest. 93.9 FM and AM 820. NPR News and the New York Conversation.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC, live in the Greene Space today. You can watch streaming video of the show if you'd like at WNYC.org or on the WNYC Facebook page. And we've talked a lot about history today, including its legacy for today's world and potentially tomorrow's. Many people in the audience may or may not know that today is Juneteenth, the day we commemorate the abolition of slavery. On June 19th, 1865, 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, 250,000 black Texans were among the final enslaved African Americans to learn of their freedom. The news was delivered by Union Army General and New Yorker Gordon Granger. So June 19th, is one of the most monumental events in American history. But while 43 states recognize Juneteenth, it's only an official holiday in the state of Texas. In most places, it's celebrated informally, if at all, and many people are unaware of what Juneteenth celebrates or even that it's a thing. And it begs the question of why. And yet our understanding of the legacy of slavery also seems to beg for a revised or evolving understanding of Juneteenth even today. So here to discuss Juneteenth are Dr. Cheryl Wilson. She is a former director of the African Burial Ground Project in Lower Manhattan, and also historian Kenneth C. Davis, who is the author of Don't Know Much About History and the whole series of Don't Know Much About books. Dr. Wilson, Ken Davis, welcome to the Greene Space.
Thank you.
And Ken, you have written, and I know you're both presenting later at the African Burial Ground, you've written that Juneteenth remains largely unacknowledged on America's calendar and that it's a hidden history. Can you elaborate a little bit and discuss why you think so much of this history has been lost?
Well, 50 years ago, Brian, the Kerner Commission said we were moving towards a nation, two nations, one black, one white, separate, unequal. We've had two histories for a very long time, one black, one white, separate and unequal, and Juneteenth is a perfect example of that. It is a day that holds tremendous meaning in the African American community, especially of an earlier generation, and particularly in the South, because this was a tradition that was lost. Just to recap, General Granger entered Galveston, Texas in 1865, June 1865. He brought with him 1,800 Union troops. The war had ended, obviously, a few months earlier in April of 1865. Among those 1,800 troops were U.S. colored troops, and the sight of black men in blue uniforms carrying guns was shocking to both the white and black Texans of that time. And Granger makes this announcement from a balcony in Galveston on June 19th, and it's met with shock, extraordinary jubilation, and almost immediately it becomes a day of celebration the following year, Juneteenth, this portmanteau of June and 19th. So it is a holiday that resonated throughout the African American community. Isabel Wilkerson writes about how it traveled north during the Great Migration, and then during the Civil Rights era was more or less forgotten. But it is a day that is a fulfillment. It's the other Independence Day that really brings to a conclusion what 4th of July means to most Americans.
And Dr. Wilson, you've noted that Juneteenth is now increasingly celebrated in different spots around the world, meaning including outside the United States?
Absolutely. And I think that is because as African Americans, we've taken Juneteenth to other places. Places where there are U.S. military bases in particular, there are celebrations of Juneteenth. In South Korea, that is the case. There have been celebrations in Japan as well as in Paris. Honduras, a number of places. We often think about how when we go someplace we're affected by being in that place. But as African Americans, as others, when we go someplace, other people are affected by us. Now, those are organizations that have organized Juneteenth celebrations, but there are also individuals, teachers in places like Shanghai and in Germany that have noted, at least on Juneteenth.com, that they have taken an interest in teaching their classes. So ultimately, we don't know what the outcome of that will be, but it is spreading and becoming more commonly known outside of the United States than it has been.
Now, reckoning with the past that some people would prefer to forget is also the subject of a powerful episode that many of you may have heard from WNYC's On the Media. In the episode just a couple of weeks ago, they visited the Legacy Museum and National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, which honors the victims of American lynching. Here is 38 seconds of what the founder of that memorial, Brian Stevenson, had to say.
I hear people talking about the civil rights movement, and it's starting to sound like a 3-day carnival. On day 1, Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat on a bus. On day 2, Dr. King led a march on Washington. And on day 3, we passed these laws and racism was over. And I knew we were in trouble when I saw state tourism agencies taking out ads in civil rights memorial books, saying things like, in 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King partnered with the people of Alabama to create a better future. Literally the language that is used. If you think polio is just like a cold, then you're not committed to creating a polio vaccination.
Brian Stevenson on that very powerful episode of OTM, which I would recommend to everybody, called The Worst Thing We Have Ever Done. And Dr. Wilson, in the context of Juneteenth, hearing Brian Stevenson, maybe you want to think for a minute about this idea of how not being in touch with history can create problems today?
Well, history is obviously very circular. 25 years ago, when the African burial ground was rediscovered, because there were people who knew about it previously, my job in particular, along with a number of other people, including 350 volunteers from 41 states, were spreading the word about the knowledge of slavery in the North. One of the major misconceptions that people today still have is that slavery in America was confined to the South, to southern states, to southern colonies, when in fact it's very clear and very clearly overlooked that slavery is a part of the history of each of the original 13 colonies. New York City in particular in the 1700s, it is believed to have had the second largest enslaved African population of any place in colonial America, second only to Charleston, South Carolina. Now, as educated people, well-informed people, if we don't know that, that's a problem. As the saying goes, and I don't remember who said it, if we don't know that history, we are bound to repeat it. And even today, I meet people after the battle for the recognition of the African burial ground, which is now a national monument, who say, oh, the African burial ground, what's that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want to play another clip from that episode of On the Media that goes to this. And we're going to skip ahead, control room, to clip 3. This is from an interview on that program with Peter Weisenberger, a newspaper editor in Berlin, about how Germany memorializes the Holocaust.
The controversial thing is about it that once you start, you're never going to be done. So there's no such thing as dealing with it and then finally having dealt with it. And I think this is what makes people so afraid to start dealing with history at all. There's no point in which we can say, okay, we're done now. This is always going to be what happened. There's always going to have been millions of people that were killed in a fascist, racist killing machinery and a whole society of bystanders. And it's much easier to sort of compartmentalize it and be outraged as somebody puts a large monument right in the middle of your capital. I mean, right-wing people now are addressing it as a wound of shame that's in the middle of our capital.
The Holocaust Memorial.
The Holocaust Memorial. Because they want history, especially the history of Germany, to be something where there's this thing that happened, but that's in the past. We strayed off our path there. But I believe that it's more important to acknowledge that this part of your history makes up the organism of your society and something that is always going to be tearing on you. And this is what a lot of people feel like can't be asked of them, to always feel like there's something internally wrong with the way that their society was created.
Peter Weisenberger, newspaper editor in Berlin, with Brooke Gladstone on the Worst Thing We've Ever Done episode of On the Media a couple of weeks ago. That's tough stuff. Ken, how do you relate to it as a historian?
Well, I was recently at the Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., this fabulous new location, which, of course, lies in the shadow of the Washington Monument. For most of the past 200 years, we had a story of George Washington as the perfect man, the indispensable man, and we left out the other half of the story, which is that he was a slaveholder and that his power as president came from his slaveholding, and that's one of the reasons I wrote In the Shadow of Liberty about the hidden history of slavery and its relationship to presidents, and focused on 5 people who were enslaved by presidents, including Washington, because we have left this part of the story out. Now, we have to bring it into balance. I think there's been some reckoning with the fact that there is a Museum of African American History and Culture. There is a museum of lynching now in Alabama. So it's the reckoning over Confederate statues is part of it, but we are also experiencing this incredible pushback from that right now. So we are at this, I don't know if it's a pendulum swing moment, but we're certainly in a very tense moment between these two obviously opposing viewpoints.
Dr. Wilson, what are you thinking?
Well, it seems to me that we have to keep repeating the facts over and over, and also to be open that there are undiscovered facts. One of the common problems that we had at the African burial ground was while there were literally thousands of students from surrounding New York areas, from elementary school through Fordham University, Columbia University students, people would come in and look around when we were doing lab tours and basically images of the photos from the excavation at 6 World Trade Center. And they would say, wow, this is really interesting, but my professor says there's not enough information for me to write a paper on this or to work on my master's degree. And that is just untrue. There's so many undiscovered aspects of Africans in New York in particular. And I like to say, especially to an audience like this, if all of you were to stop doing whatever you're doing right now and focused on nothing but the African presence in our lifetimes, I don't believe we'd have time to actually cover everything that there is out there.
Yeah, and thinking about that Peter Weisenberger clip in the context of Juneteenth, is there a risk that talking about the end of slavery in too simplistic a way to honor this holiday suggests that there was an end to the problem? And so maybe we need to talk about Juneteenth in an evolving way that maybe people haven't even talked. Not that I know how everybody celebrated Juneteenth, but Dr. Wilson, I wonder if you think that it needs to be this sort of unfolding conversation.
Well, I definitely think that it is an open-ended conversation. As an African American, and I heard this for 12 and a half years and continue here today, one of the major issues that people will say, particularly the older the person is, the burial ground is so important to me because until it was rediscovered, people would say Africans came here from the South when the crops were failing and the Klan was on the rise. No one thought of Africans as the founders, among the founding fathers of New Amsterdam and New York. And that is our true place in history, which again has been neglected. So I think, again, we can have Juneteenth celebrations from now on because there's so many ways to have them in terms of lectures, radio shows, television shows, things other than simply having another barbecue on June 19th, which many people associate, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that. But our history is no less important and valuable than the history of other Americans.
Now, later today, folks, if you happen to be in the area, at the African Burial Ground National Monument, which is 290 Broadway in Lower Manhattan, both Cheryl Wilson and Kenneth C. Davis will be delivering lectures to commemorate Juneteenth. Ken Davis will be speaking at 1 o'clock. Cheryl Wilson will be speaking at 6:30 p.m. Can you give like a 15-second preview?
Well,
or anything you want to say?
I think the preview in part is provided by Monticello this past week. They just opened up Sally Hemings's room adjacent to Thomas Jefferson's bedroom. I don't
this
know of a
long.
more perfect way to put a bow on it than that. Juneteenth is not just a feel-good moment to have red soda and barbecue, but to recognize that the hard history of slavery means that this institution, these millions of people, were part of American history. They were part of the wealth and the power of America from its beginnings, and that's what we're still contending with today because, as Faulkner said, the past is never really past.
And Dr. Wilson, for the sake of potential future visitors, what can they find at the African Burial Ground National Monument?
Well, there is art that commemorates the New York African presence, as well as a visitor center where you may see artifacts, replicas of artifacts from the burial ground itself, and get tours from the rangers and guides there on the history of the African presence in New York in the context of the African burial ground.
Cheryl Wilson, urban anthropologist, former director of the Office of Public Education and Interpretation at the New York African Burial Ground Project, professor at Manhattan College, and author of New York City's Black Slave Owners, A Social and Material Culture History, and Kenneth C. Davis, author of books including In the Shadow of Liberty, The Hidden History of Slavery, 4 Presidents and 5 Black Lives. Thank you both so much.
A pleasure.
And thanks to all of you audience for coming to the Greene Space today.
WNYC is supported by Your Part-Time Controller, helping nonprofit organizations with all of their accounting and financial reporting needs. Your Part-Time Controller, the nonprofit accounting specialists. More at yourparttimecontroller.com. WNYC is a media partner for the 40th season of the Celebrate Brooklyn Festival. Named one of NPR's 10 Best Living Songwriters, Amy Mann, pop-punk band Superchunk, and Jonathan Colton perform Thursday, 7:30 p.m. at the Prospect Park Bandshell. BrickArtsMedia.org.
June 19th marks the date slaves in Texas were notified